Donald Trump did not begin the exchange in Phoenix with ideology, nor with a defense of his presidency. He began with a question directed squarely at Congressman Jamie Raskin, and that question centered on money, disclosure, and the standards Raskin himself had spent years invoking against others. In a hall filled with thousands of supporters, media cameras, and a moderator struggling to maintain structure, the confrontation immediately shifted from abstract constitutional theory to a specific personal line of inquiry. The issue on the table was not whether corruption exists in Washington, a point few in the room disputed, but whether the rules of transparency are applied evenly to those who claim to enforce them. From that moment forward, the evening ceased to resemble a typical political debate, and instead unfolded as a sustained examination of credibility. Jamie Raskin arrived in Phoenix with a well-established public identity. He is widely known as a constitutional law professor, a senior Democratic lawmaker, and a prominent figure in congressional investigations targeting Trump. For years, Raskin had framed his political mission around accountability, ethical governance, and the defense of democratic norms. He had spoken forcefully in hearings, on cable news, and in opinion pieces about conflicts of interest, abuse of power, and the moral obligations of public officials. Those positions formed the backdrop against which Trump chose to engage him. Trump, for his part, framed the exchange not as retaliation, but as inversion. Rather than rebutting past accusations point by point, he questioned whether the standards Raskin applied to others were reflected in his own conduct and disclosures. This approach allowed Trump to reposition himself not as the defendant in a long series of investigations, but as the interrogator. The strategy was simple in structure, if not in implication. Focus on one concrete case and expand outward from there. The case Trump highlighted involved Raskin's wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, and her professional association with a financial technology firm known as Reserve Trust. According to publicly available records and subsequent reporting, Sarah Bloom Raskin joined the board of Reserve Trust in 2017 after previously serving in senior roles at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. Reserve Trust, a fintech company, sought access to a Federal Reserve master account, a designation that allows direct interaction with the Federal Reserve's payment system. Such accounts are rare, highly regulated, and typically limited to traditional banks or select financial institutions. Reserve Trust's initial application was denied, a fact that later became central to the political dispute. What followed, and how it should be interpreted, became the core of Trump's opening argument. Trump did not accuse Raskin of a crime in the legal sense. Instead, he presented a timeline and asked whether the sequence of events created at least the appearance of a conflict of interest. That timeline included a reported phone call from Sarah Bloom Raskin to a senior Federal Reserve official after Reserve Trust's initial denial. It also included the eventual approval of the master account and the later sale of stock by Sarah Bloom Raskin for approximately $1.5 million. The implication was not framed as proof of illegality, but as a challenge to Raskin's public rhetoric about ethics and transparency. For Trump's supporters, the argument resonated immediately. They viewed it as evidence that elite political figures benefit from access and connections unavailable to ordinary Americans. For Raskin's defenders, the argument appeared selective and misleading, lacking proof of improper influence or quid pro quo. This divergence in interpretation underscored a broader divide in American politics, where identical facts can generate radically different conclusions depending on prior trust. Trump leaned into that divide by emphasizing not certainty, but contrast. A key element of the opening was disclosure. Members of Congress are required under federal law to report certain financial transactions within a defined time frame. Trump highlighted reporting delays related to the stock sale, suggesting that even if no law was broken, the delay conflicted with the standards Raskin had publicly demanded of others. Raskin responded by citing personal tragedy during the reporting period, a factor that introduced a human dimension into an otherwise procedural debate. Trump acknowledged that loss but argued that professional obligations had continued uninterrupted during the same time frame. This exchange established a recurring pattern. Trump would present a sequence of events and ask whether they aligned with Raskin's stated principles. Raskin would respond by disputing the framing, the relevance, or the implications of those events. Neither side conceded the other's premise, and the moderator struggled to impose closure. What mattered for the opening was not resolution, but positioning. Trump positioned himself as exposing inconsistency, while Raskin positioned himself as rejecting what he characterized as politicized insinuation. From there, Trump broadened the scope. He argued that Raskin's approach to investigations reflected a pattern of selective skepticism. In particular, he contrasted Raskin's dismissal of inquiries into the Biden family's foreign financial dealings with his aggressive pursuit of allegations against Trump and his associates. Trump cited public statements in which Raskin described those investigations as baseless or politically motivated. The underlying question was not whether the Biden family had committed crimes, but whether similar evidentiary standards were being applied. The opening segment also touched on media amplification. Trump suggested that narratives unfavorable to Democrats were minimized or reframed by major outlets, while allegations against Republicans received sustained coverage. He did not present this as a coordinated conspiracy, but as a structural bias shaped by incentives and ideological alignment. Raskin rejected this characterization, defending institutional norms and the legitimacy of past investigations. The disagreement highlighted competing views of how information flows through modern political systems. Another theme introduced early was January 6th. Trump criticized the congressional committee investigating the Capitol breach, of which Raskin was a central figure. He argued that the committee operated more as a prosecutorial body than a fact-finding one, emphasizing selective evidence and predetermined conclusions. To illustrate this claim, Trump referenced individuals charged with minor offenses who faced severe consequences. These references were intended to humanize the argument and shift focus from abstract threats to democracy to individual outcomes. At no point in the opening did Trump concede wrongdoing related to January 6th. Instead, he framed the issue as proportionality and due process. Raskin maintained that the events of that day represented a serious threat requiring exceptional response. This fundamental disagreement over framing underscored why the two men spoke past each other. One viewed the matter through institutional risk, the other through individual rights. Trump then introduced a comparison involving Supreme Court ethics. He criticized Raskin's public attacks on Justice Clarence Thomas, particularly regarding undisclosed gifts. Trump argued that Raskin's moral certainty in that context contrasted sharply with his defense of his own family's conduct. Again, the argument was not that the situations were legally identical, but that they revealed inconsistent moral reasoning. For Trump, this inconsistency undermined Raskin's authority as an ethics advocate. The opening concluded by expanding the dispute beyond the two men on stage. Trump framed Raskin as representative of a broader political class that speaks the language of reform while benefiting from existing structures. Raskin rejected this characterization, positioning himself as a lifelong public servant acting in good faith. The audience reacted predictably along partisan lines, but the framing had been set. The debate would proceed not as a discussion of policy, but as a contest over who had the standing to lecture the public about ethics. What made the opening effective, regardless of one's political alignment, was its focus. Trump did not attempt to relitigate every past controversy. He selected one case, tied it to broader themes, and returned repeatedly to the question of standards. Raskin, accustomed to prosecuting others rhetorically, now faced sustained scrutiny himself. Whether that scrutiny was fair or opportunistic would be debated, but it could not be ignored. By the end of the opening segment, the contours of the night were clear. This was not a clash over ideology, but over credibility. Not a debate about constitutional theory, but about who embodies the principles they espouse. The remainder of the exchange would build on these foundations, escalating in detail and intensity. But the central question had already been posed, and it would linger over everything that followed. After the opening exchange established the central tension, the discussion moved quickly into deeper territory, where the political became inseparable from the personal. Trump did not retreat to generalities or ideological framing. Instead, he returned repeatedly to the same core question, asking whether the standards Jamie Raskin had enforced against others were being applied consistently when the scrutiny turned inward. This repetition was deliberate, not rhetorical filler, but a method of narrowing the debate until avoidance became increasingly difficult. Each return to the question carried additional context, expanding its implications rather than changing its substance. The focus on Sarah Bloom Raskin remained central, not because she was present, but because her career embodied the revolving door debate that dominates modern discussions of governance and influence. Trump emphasized her credentials, noting her experience at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, framing them not as disqualifying, but as empowering. The implication was that such experience provides insight not only into policy, but into process, including whom to contact and how decisions are made. Trump argued that this knowledge, while earned legitimately, becomes ethically sensitive when paired with private financial gain. Raskin countered by asserting that expertise should not disqualify individuals from private sector roles, a position widely shared across party lines. The disagreement was not over whether former officials may enter private industry, but over timing, disclosure, and influence. Trump highlighted the sequence again, drawing attention to the proximity between board membership, regulatory engagement, and financial outcome. Raskin responded that correlation does not imply causation and that regulatory decisions involve multiple layers beyond any single phone call. This response appealed to procedural complexity, a common defense when allegations rest on circumstantial inference. Trump, however, argued that complexity does not negate responsibility to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. As the exchange continued, Trump broadened the issue from one family to a governing culture. He argued that Washington operates under informal rules understood by insiders but invisible to the public. Access, relationships, and familiarity with institutions create advantages that are technically legal yet politically corrosive. Raskin rejected the notion that such dynamics are unique to one party, insisting that ethical reform must be systemic rather than selective. This acknowledgement, while conciliatory in tone, did little to diffuse the immediate line of questioning. The crowd reacted strongly whenever Trump contrasted elite outcomes with everyday struggles. References to teachers' salaries, small business financing, and bureaucratic barriers resonated not as policy critiques, but as lived frustrations. These moments functioned as rhetorical anchoring, translating abstract ethics into tangible disparity. Raskin attempted to steer the discussion back toward structural reform, emphasizing legislation rather than anecdote. Yet, the emotional weight of personal comparison proved difficult to neutralize. The conversation then shifted toward disclosure laws themselves. Trump cited reporting timelines and statutory requirements, framing them as straightforward obligations rather than burdensome regulations. Raskin acknowledged the importance of disclosure, but argued that administrative delays do not equate to concealment. Here, the disagreement centered on interpretation rather than fact. Trump treated delay as evidence of selective seriousness, while Raskin treated it as an unfortunate but understandable lapse. This tension exposed a deeper philosophical divide. Trump approached ethics as a matter of public perception and trust, arguing that officials must anticipate skepticism rather than merely satisfy minimum legal standards. Raskin emphasized intent and context, suggesting that ethical judgment must consider circumstances beyond procedural checklists. Neither approach is inherently illegitimate, but they lead to vastly different conclusions. The exchange revealed how ethical debates often hinge less on facts than on frameworks. Trump then pivoted to Raskin's role in prior investigations, particularly those involving Trump himself. He argued that the aggressiveness with which Raskin pursued allegations against political opponents contrasted sharply with his caution when addressing questions involving allies. Trump cited Raskin's public dismissal of investigations into the Biden family as politically motivated. Raskin responded by questioning the evidentiary basis of those investigations and defending his assessments as grounded in available information. The disagreement highlighted how trust in evidence often aligns with trust in institutions presenting it. At this point, the discussion moved beyond individual cases and into metapolitics. Trump argued that investigative power has become a partisan tool, deployed unevenly depending on target. Raskin rejected this framing, insisting that oversight is a constitutional responsibility, not a weapon. Both positions carry historical precedent, and neither can be evaluated without reference to broader institutional behavior. The exchange illustrated how oversight itself has become contested terrain. January 6th entered the discussion not as an isolated event, but as an example of prosecutorial intensity. Trump criticized the congressional committee's structure, arguing that it blurred the line between inquiry and advocacy. He referenced individuals charged with nonviolent offenses who experienced severe legal consequences. These references were intended to question proportionality, rather than deny the seriousness of the breach. Raskin maintained that the event warranted extraordinary scrutiny due to its implications for democratic continuity. The disagreement again rested on framing. Trump framed January 6th as a disorderly but unevenly prosecuted event, while Raskin framed it as an unprecedented assault on institutional legitimacy. Each framing supports different policy responses and moral conclusions. The exchange did not resolve this conflict, but clarified its contours. It underscored why consensus on accountability remains elusive. Trump then criticized what he described as selective empathy. He argued that political elites express concern for abstract democratic principles while remaining detached from individual consequences. The story of a January 6 defendant served as an illustration of this claim. Raskin did not dispute the hardship described, but argued that individual cases should not overshadow systemic risk. This exchange reflected a recurring tension between macro-level governance and micro-level justice. The discussion of media coverage intensified this tension. Trump argued that narratives are shaped less by facts than by alignment, resulting in asymmetric scrutiny. He cited examples where allegations against Democrats received limited attention compared to sustained coverage of Republican controversies. Raskin defended the press as imperfect but essential, warning against conflating criticism with conspiracy. The disagreement mirrored a broader national debate about trust in information intermediaries. Supreme Court ethics emerged as another axis of conflict. Trump criticized Raskin's public condemnation of Justice Clarence Thomas, arguing that it lacked proportional context. He suggested that Raskin's moral certainty in that case contrasted with his measured defense of his own family's conduct. Raskin responded by emphasizing the distinct roles of judges and legislators. The exchange highlighted how ethical expectations vary by office, complicating direct comparison. Trump's argument here relied on symmetry rather than equivalence. He did not claim identical circumstances, but questioned consistency in moral judgment. Raskin rejected this framing, arguing that institutional power demands tailored standards. This disagreement again reflected differing ethical philosophies. One emphasized uniform perception, the other role-specific obligation. As the debate progressed, Trump broadened his critique to include wealth and rhetoric. He argued that Raskin's lifestyle and income placed him among the very elites he criticized. Raskin countered that personal success does not invalidate advocacy for systemic reform. This exchange echoed long-standing debates about representation and authenticity. It revealed how economic identity has become politically symbolic. The crowd's reaction to these exchanges varied sharply. Supporters of Trump saw hypocrisy, while supporters of Raskin saw deflection. Undecided observers faced a more complex picture, one lacking clear resolution. The moderator's role became increasingly difficult as emotional intensity rose. Yet the discussion remained largely within rhetorical bounds. Throughout the main body, Trump maintained a consistent strategy. He avoided introducing entirely new allegations, instead deepening existing ones. This repetition reinforced narrative cohesion and prevented fragmentation. Raskin responded by challenging premises rather than counterattacking. This asymmetry shaped audience perception, regardless of factual assessment. The exchange also illustrated the limits of public debate. Complex regulatory processes were reduced to symbolic moments. Legal nuance struggled to compete with narrative clarity. Both men spoke past each other at times, appealing to different audiences. The debate functioned as performance as much as persuasion. As the main body drew toward its latter stages, the stakes escalated rhetorically. Trump framed the issue as emblematic of a broader accountability crisis. Raskin framed it as a cautionary tale about politicized scrutiny. Neither framing could fully absorb the other. The result was not consensus, but clarity about disagreement. What became evident was that the confrontation was less about establishing truth than about defining legitimacy. Who has the authority to judge, and on what basis? Trump argued that authority derives from transparency and consistency. Raskin argued that authority derives from institutional role and evidentiary rigor. These competing claims shaped every exchange. The main body did not resolve the questions it raised. Instead, it layered them, building complexity rather than closure. Each argument generated counterarguments without synthesis. This lack of resolution mirrored the broader political environment. It left the audience to interpret rather than receive instruction. By the end of the main body, the confrontation had expanded beyond its initial focus. What began as a question about disclosure had become a referendum on political ethics. The personal had become systemic, and the systemic had become symbolic. Both men remained standing, rhetorically unyielding. The conclusion would determine whether any meaning could be distilled from the collision. As the exchange pressed forward, the emphasis increasingly shifted from isolated decisions to long-term patterns of behavior. Trump argued that credibility in public life is cumulative, built or eroded over years, rather than determined by a single incident. He suggested that when a lawmaker repeatedly positions himself as an arbiter of ethics, Every personal and familial decision becomes part of the public record by default. Raskin pushed back against this framing, warning that such logic risks turning politics into perpetual suspicion rather than principled oversight. The tension between vigilance and presumption became one of the defining undercurrents of the debate. Trump returned again to the concept of disclosure, this time broadening it beyond statutory compliance. He argued that disclosure is not merely a legal requirement, but a signal of respect toward constituents. From his perspective, the delay in reporting a significant financial transaction undermined confidence, regardless of intent. Raskin maintained that the law provides mechanisms for correction precisely because human circumstances can interfere with timing. This exchange highlighted how procedural safeguards can be interpreted either as protections or as loopholes, depending on perspective. The discussion then moved toward the role of congressional investigations themselves. Trump criticized what he described as a prosecutorial tone adopted by certain committees, including those in which Raskin played a central role. He argued that investigations should clarify facts rather than advance predetermined narratives. Raskin responded by emphasizing the evidentiary record developed during those inquiries and the seriousness of the issues under review. The disagreement reflected broader public skepticism toward investigative bodies, especially when outcomes align closely with partisan expectations. Trump framed this skepticism as a consequence of selective enforcement. He suggested that when investigations consistently target one political camp while excusing or minimizing concerns within another, legitimacy suffers. Raskin countered that oversight priorities reflect the gravity of alleged misconduct, not partisan preference. This exchange underscored how deeply contested the notion of fairness has become in American political culture. Both sides appealed to principle, yet neither accepted the other's premise. As the debate unfolded, the audience's reactions continued to shape the atmosphere. Moments of applause and silence served as informal verdicts on rhetorical effectiveness rather than factual accuracy. Trump appeared attuned to these cues, adjusting pacing and emphasis accordingly. Raskin remained composed, relying on measured responses and institutional language. The contrast reinforced perceptions of performance versus procedure, a recurring theme throughout the night. Trump then addressed the concept of influence, distinguishing it from corruption. He acknowledged that influence is inherent in governance, particularly for individuals with experience and connections. The ethical challenge, he argued, lies in managing that influence transparently and responsibly. Raskin agreed in principle, but rejected the implication that influence equates to misconduct absent concrete evidence. This exchange highlighted how ethical debates often hinge on thresholds rather than absolutes. The discussion of influence naturally extended to media representation. Trump argued that certain narratives gain traction because they align with prevailing institutional assumptions. He suggested that skepticism toward claims against Democrats is often framed as responsible caution, while skepticism toward claims against Republicans is framed as denial. Raskin defended journalistic norms, emphasizing the importance of corroboration and editorial judgment. The disagreement reflected divergent assessments of media credibility rather than factual disputes. Trump then revisited January 6th, this time focusing on consequences rather than causes. He argued that the legal aftermath disproportionately affected individuals who posed minimal threat. By highlighting personal stories, he sought to personalize what he viewed as systemic overreach. Raskin maintained that accountability must address the collective impact of the event, not only individual actions. This exchange again revealed competing priorities: deterrence versus proportionality. The debate's tone grew more serious as these issues accumulated. Neither participant relied heavily on humor or insult, opting instead for sustained argumentation. This seriousness contributed to the perception that the exchange mattered beyond immediate political theater. The moderator's interventions became less frequent, perhaps recognizing that interruption would disrupt the narrative flow. The audience, too, seemed increasingly focused, rather than reactive. Trump then turned to the question of institutional trust. He argued that trust erodes when rules appear flexible for those with power and rigid for those without. Raskin responded by emphasizing the complexity of governance and the dangers of oversimplification. This exchange encapsulated a central dilemma of democratic accountability. Transparency demands clarity, yet governance often resists simplification. The discussion of Supreme Court ethics re-emerged as a case study in this dilemma. Trump argued that public confidence requires consistent scrutiny across branches of government. Raskin emphasized the unique role of the judiciary and the need for tailored standards. Both positions carried logical coherence within their respective frameworks. The disagreement lay in whether consistency or contextualization should take precedence. Trump's critique of wealth and rhetoric resurfaced as the debate progressed. He argued that economic success achieved through public service carries different ethical implications than success achieved in the private sector. Raskin rejected the suggestion that public servants should be financially constrained beyond legal requirements. This exchange touched on long-standing debates about compensation, sacrifice, and public trust. It revealed how economic narratives intersect with moral expectations. Throughout the main body, Trump maintained a disciplined focus on a limited set of themes. He avoided introducing new controversies, instead reinforcing existing ones through repetition and expansion. This approach created narrative cohesion, even for skeptical listeners. Raskin responded by challenging assumptions and reframing questions, preserving his own coherence. The debate thus became less about persuasion and more about parallel argumentation. The audience's role remained significant. Their reactions provided feedback loops that influenced emphasis and pacing. Trump leveraged these reactions to underscore points about public sentiment. Raskin appeared less responsive to crowd dynamics, focusing instead on argument integrity. This contrast reflected differing communication philosophies. As the exchange continued, the notion of accountability became increasingly abstract. Trump framed accountability as exposure, believing that sunlight itself enforces standards. Raskin framed accountability as process, requiring investigation, evidence, and institutional judgment. Both conceptions have merit, yet they lead to different political outcomes. The debate illuminated this divergence without resolving it. The conversation also highlighted the limits of public forums. Complex regulatory decisions were condensed into symbolic moments. Legal nuance struggled to survive the demands of narrative clarity. Both participants simplified at times, though in different ways. This simplification is inherent in mass political communication. As the main body approached its latter stages, fatigue became visible. The audience remained engaged, but the intensity shifted from excitement to contemplation. Trump's delivery slowed slightly, suggesting a transition toward synthesis. Raskin maintained composure, though his responses grew more concise. The debate's momentum suggested an impending shift toward conclusion. Trump summarized his position by reiterating the importance of consistency. He argued that public officials must expect scrutiny proportionate to their moral claims. Raskin summarized his by emphasizing fairness and evidence. Neither conceded ground, yet both articulated coherent frameworks. The audience was left to evaluate which framework better aligned with their expectations. What emerged from the extended exchange was not a verdict, but a map of disagreement. The issues discussed were familiar, but their juxtaposition revealed new tensions. Ethics, disclosure, influence, media, and accountability intertwined in complex ways. The debate demonstrated how personal narratives intersect with institutional roles. It also showed how deeply polarized interpretations have become. By the time the main body concluded, the initial question had expanded beyond its origin. What began as scrutiny of a specific financial timeline had become a broader examination of political legitimacy. The exchange did not resolve whether wrongdoing occurred. Instead, it clarified how different actors define responsibility and trust. The conclusion would need to grapple with these unresolved questions. As the discussion moved deeper into its later stages, the emphasis increasingly turned toward how power is exercised rather than how it is justified. Trump argued that public trust erodes not only when laws are broken, but when those in authority appear insulated from the consequences faced by ordinary citizens. He framed this as a cultural problem rather than a partisan one, suggesting that long tenure within institutions can dull sensitivity to public perception. Raskin rejected this framing, insisting that experience strengthens, rather than weakens, an official's understanding of responsibility. The disagreement highlighted how longevity in public service can be interpreted either as dedication or detachment. Trump returned again to the idea of unequal consequences. He argued that when citizens face severe penalties for technical or minor violations while elites navigate complex explanations for larger lapses, resentment becomes inevitable. This point was not presented as an accusation against a single individual, but as a systemic observation. Raskin responded by emphasizing that the justice system evaluates cases individually, not symbolically. Yet the symbolic dimension remained central to Trump's argument. The discussion briefly touched on institutional incentives. Trump suggested that political and bureaucratic systems reward conformity and punish disruption, regardless of merit. Raskin countered that institutions rely on continuity to function, and that disruption without evidence risks undermining stability. This exchange reflected contrasting views of reform. One prioritizes exposure and pressure, the other gradual change within established frameworks. As the exchange unfolded, Trump emphasized the importance of public memory. He argued that repeated controversies, even when unresolved, accumulate into broader judgments. From his perspective, voters assess patterns rather than legal outcomes alone. Raskin acknowledged that perception matters, but cautioned against allowing narrative momentum to replace factual evaluation. This tension underscored a fundamental challenge in democratic accountability. The conversation then returned to the role of lawmakers as moral authorities. Trump questioned whether those who frame themselves as ethical arbiters invite heightened scrutiny by definition. Raskin responded that moral advocacy does not imply moral infallibility. This exchange revealed differing expectations of public figures. One expects consistency approaching perfection. The other allows for human limitation. Trump argued that modern politics often conflates intention with outcome. He suggested that good intentions cannot excuse opaque processes or delayed transparency. Raskin emphasized that intention remains relevant in ethical evaluation, particularly when assessing complex circumstances. The disagreement reflected competing ethical theories rather than factual disputes. It illustrated how moral reasoning varies even among those committed to public service. The crowd's energy shifted subtly during this phase. Applause became less frequent, replaced by sustained attention. Listeners appeared to be weighing arguments rather than reacting instinctively. This shift suggested that the debate had moved beyond spectacle. It had become, at least momentarily, reflective. Trump then addressed the broader implications of selective trust. He argued that when institutions demand unquestioned confidence while resisting scrutiny, legitimacy weakens. Raskin countered that skepticism must be balanced with respect for expertise. This exchange mirrored broader societal debates about authority in an age of information abundance. Neither side offered an easy resolution. The discussion of oversight mechanisms resurfaced. Trump criticized what he described as closed-loop accountability, where institutions investigate themselves. Raskin defended existing checks as imperfect but necessary. This disagreement highlighted how structural reform remains contested. It also revealed how trust depends on both process and perception. As the debate continued, Trump emphasized that his critique was not limited to one party. He acknowledged that similar issues exist across the political spectrum. This acknowledgement aimed to frame his argument as populist rather than partisan. Raskin welcomed the sentiment, but questioned its sincerity given the selective focus. The exchange underscored how claims of neutrality are themselves contested. Trump then reflected on the personal toll of prolonged political conflict. He argued that investigations and accusations impose costs beyond legal outcomes. Raskin acknowledged the strain, but emphasized the necessity of accountability in public life. This exchange highlighted the human dimension of political warfare. It also illustrated how personal resilience becomes politicized. The conversation briefly touched on generational trust. Trump suggested that younger Americans view institutions with skepticism shaped by perceived hypocrisy. Raskin argued that institutional reform, not cynicism, offers a constructive path forward. This exchange pointed toward future implications beyond the immediate debate. It suggested that credibility today influences engagement tomorrow. As the main body neared its end, both men appeared aware that the exchange had exceeded initial expectations. What began as a focused inquiry had expanded into a multifaceted examination of governance. Neither participant claimed victory. Instead, both sought to leave the audience with a framework for interpretation. This restraint marked a departure from more performative political clashes. Trump summarized his position once more, emphasizing consistency, transparency, and public trust. Raskin summarized his by emphasizing evidence, context, and institutional integrity. The parallel summaries underscored how the debate had crystallized around values rather than facts alone. Each framework appealed to different assumptions about authority. The audience was left to decide which assumptions resonated more strongly. By the end of this extended main body, the exchange had accomplished something unusual. It exposed not only disagreement, but the underlying philosophies driving that disagreement. Rather than collapsing into slogans, the debate revealed complexity. It demonstrated how ethical disputes persist even among those who claim similar goals. The unresolved nature of the conversation reflected the broader state of American politics. The transition toward conclusion felt less like closure and more like pause. Questions raised remained unanswered, not due to evasion, but due to genuine divergence. The audience had witnessed a sustained interrogation of standards without definitive judgment. This ambiguity, while unsatisfying to some, mirrored democratic reality. The conclusion would need to grapple with that ambiguity rather than erase it. As the exchange in Phoenix drew toward its end, what lingered in the room was not a sense of finality, but a recognition of unresolved tension. Neither Donald Trump nor Jamie Raskin offered a closing statement that pretended to settle the questions raised. Instead, both appeared to understand that the confrontation had moved beyond any single allegation or defense. The audience was left not with a verdict, but with a framework through which to interpret competing claims of legitimacy. That outcome, while unsatisfying for those seeking clarity, was perhaps the most honest reflection of contemporary political reality. At its core, the confrontation revolved around standards rather than statutes. The discussion did not hinge on a judicial determination of guilt or innocence, nor did it culminate in a demand for immediate sanction. Instead, it asked whether public figures who define themselves as guardians of ethics should be judged by a higher bar than the law alone requires. Trump argued that moral authority demands consistency that anticipates skepticism. Raskin argued that ethical judgment must be grounded in evidence, context, and process rather than inference. This divergence is not merely rhetorical. It reflects two competing visions of accountability. One treats transparency as a proactive obligation that extends beyond legal minimums. The other treats transparency as a procedural requirement whose meaning depends on circumstances and intent. Both visions claim to protect public trust, yet they lead to different expectations of behavior. The Phoenix Exchange illuminated this divide without resolving it. The debate also underscored how modern political conflict often blurs the line between personal narrative and institutional critique. What began as scrutiny of a specific financial timeline expanded into questions about oversight, media framing, and the distribution of consequences. Personal stories became symbols, and symbols became proxies for broader grievances. This expansion made the discussion more resonant, but also more ambiguous. Ambiguity, however, is not necessarily a failure of discourse. One of the most striking aspects of the exchange was its restraint in legal terms. Despite the charged atmosphere, neither side attempted to deliver a prosecutorial conclusion. Trump framed his argument around appearances, standards, and public perception rather than explicit illegality. Raskin consistently redirected the discussion toward evidentiary thresholds and institutional norms. This restraint allowed the debate to remain within the realm of political analysis rather than devolving into accusation alone. The role of institutions emerged as a recurring theme. Both participants acknowledged their importance, yet they differed sharply on how institutions maintain legitimacy. Trump emphasized exposure and equal scrutiny, arguing that trust collapses when institutions appear insulated from accountability. Raskin emphasized procedural integrity, arguing that legitimacy depends on adherence to established processes, even under pressure. These positions reflect enduring debates about reform versus stability. Media dynamics also loomed large, even when not explicitly named. The exchange reflected widespread skepticism about narrative construction and selective attention. Trump suggested that coverage patterns reinforce institutional bias, while Raskin defended journalistic standards as necessary filters rather than partisan shields. Neither position fully accounted for the complexity of modern media ecosystems. Yet, the disagreement itself signaled how deeply contested the role of information intermediaries has become. Perhaps most revealing was how the audience responded over time. Initial reactions were visceral and predictable, shaped by allegiance. As the discussion deepened, those reactions gave way to sustained attention. The crowd's energy shifted from affirmation to contemplation, suggesting that the exchange had transcended simple performance. This shift hinted at a public appetite for argumentation that does not rely solely on outrage. The Phoenix confrontation also illustrated the limits of public debate. Complex regulatory decisions were compressed into symbolic moments, risking oversimplification. Legal nuance struggled to compete with narrative clarity, a challenge inherent in mass communication. Both participants simplified at times, though in different ways and for different ends. These simplifications are not flaws unique to this exchange, but features of political discourse itself. Another lasting impression was the personalization of accountability. By focusing on individual conduct, the debate invited moral evaluation rather than institutional analysis alone. This personalization can humanize abstract issues, but it can also obscure systemic dynamics. Raskin warned against allowing individual narratives to eclipse broader risks. Trump argued that systemic critique begins with individual examples. The discussion of wealth and rhetoric further complicated the picture. Trump questioned whether economic status achieved through public service carries distinct ethical expectations. Raskin countered that personal success does not negate advocacy for reform. This disagreement reflects a long-standing tension between representation and authenticity. It raises questions about who can credibly speak for whom in a stratified society. Throughout the exchange, both men demonstrated awareness of the broader audience beyond the hall. Their arguments were calibrated not only for those present, but for viewers interpreting clips and summaries later. This awareness shaped tone, pacing, and emphasis. It also limited how far either side could push without undermining credibility. The result was a debate that balanced intensity with restraint. What the Phoenix Exchange ultimately revealed was not consensus, but contrast. Contrast between exposure and process, perception and proof, immediacy and deliberation. These contrasts are not new, but their juxtaposition in a single confrontation made them more visible. The debate functioned less as persuasion than as clarification. It clarified where lines are drawn and why they remain contested. In evaluating the exchange, it is important to resist the temptation to declare winners and losers too quickly. Political debates rarely resolve underlying disagreements. They surface them. The Phoenix confrontation did exactly that, exposing assumptions that often remain implicit. It challenged viewers to consider not only what they believe, but why they believe it. Such challenges are uncomfortable but necessary. The unresolved questions raised in Phoenix extend beyond the individuals involved. They touch on how democratic societies balance skepticism with trust. They ask how institutions can enforce standards without appearing selective. They probe whether transparency should be reactive or anticipatory. These questions have no easy answers, but they shape political legitimacy. As the event concluded, the absence of closure felt intentional rather than accidental. Both Trump and Raskin appeared aware that any attempt at finality would ring hollow. Instead, they left the audience with competing frameworks through which to interpret future events. Those frameworks will influence how subsequent controversies are understood. In that sense, the debate's impact lies not in its immediate aftermath, but in its lingering influence. The Phoenix Exchange will be remembered differently depending on perspective. Supporters of Trump may view it as a long-overdue reversal of scrutiny. Supporters of Raskin may view it as a politicized distraction from substantive oversight. Others may see it as a revealing moment that exposed deeper structural tensions. All of these interpretations coexist. What cannot be denied is that the confrontation captured a broader moment in American political life. It reflected widespread frustration with perceived double standards and institutional opacity. It also reflected concern about the erosion of process and the dangers of politicized judgment. These concerns are not mutually exclusive. They coexist uneasily within the same civic space. In the end, the Phoenix debate did not offer a solution. It offered a mirror, reflecting competing anxieties about power, trust, and responsibility. Whether viewers accepted or rejected the arguments presented, they were forced to confront the standards by which they judge public figures. That confrontation, more than any specific claim, defines the significance of the event. The conversation it sparked will continue long after the lights in the convention center dimmed. The challenge now lies with the public, not the participants, to decide whether accountability should be measured by perception or process, to determine how much ambiguity they are willing to tolerate in governance, to ask whether legitimacy derives from exposure, procedure, or some balance of both. These decisions cannot be outsourced to any single debate. In this sense, the Phoenix Exchange did not close a chapter. It opened one. It invited sustained reflection rather than immediate judgment. It underscored that democratic accountability is not a destination, but a continual negotiation. That negotiation is often messy, uncomfortable, and unresolved. Yet, it remains essential to the health of the political system. The final lesson of the night may be its refusal to simplify. By resisting definitive conclusions, the exchange honored the complexity of the issues at stake. It reminded viewers that political ethics are rarely reducible to slogans or single moments. They are shaped by patterns, perceptions, and competing values over time. Recognizing that complexity may be the most constructive outcome of all.